Hello, I'm Randall Carlson, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Squaring the Circle podcast. For this episode and the one following, we're going to draw upon Greek mythology for the subject matter, the Forge of Vulcan and the Sword of Damocles. So let's jump right into it. I'll pose this question. How many viewers remember what happened over 2 days, April 14th to April 15th, 2018? I suspect that not too many, so I will refresh your memories. On April 14th, astronomers discovered Apollo asteroid 2018 GE3, which made a close pass by Earth only 1 day later, at less than half the distance to the moon. Its size was estimated to be up to 360 feet in diameter. It has been remarked that, quote, it is one of the largest known asteroids, possibly the largest, in observational history to ever pass that close to Earth, according to Wikipedia. So, what would have happened if 2018 GE3 was on a slightly different orbital trajectory and collided with the Earth? Well, we can make informed speculation to get a sense of what would ensue. Using the 1908 Tunguska hypervelocity impact event as a yardstick allows us to estimate the energy released upon impact of 2018 GE3. The Tunguska object that exploded over Siberia in 1908 was a low-density object, about 150 feet in diameter, probably a fragment of a comet. Because of its low density, it was unable to fully penetrate the atmosphere, and it exploded at an altitude of about 5 miles above the surface, releasing in the process energy roughly equivalent to a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb. Now that is about 15 million tons of TNT, or about 1,500 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Asteroid 2018 GE3 was roughly 12 to 15 times more massive than the Tunguska object, and being an asteroid, it was much denser than a piece of comet. That means that the most conservative estimate of the energy released by the impact of 2018 GE3 would likely have been at least 25 to 30 times more powerful than the Tunguska bolide impact, which utterly obliterated over 800 square miles of old-growth taiga forest. That would imply for GE3 an area of devastation somewhat around 25 to 30,000 square miles, about the size of the state of South Carolina in the U.S. But the secondary consequences would go far beyond the zone of impact. The effects would spread around the planet and would have extreme consequences upon the global economy. A short-lived cosmic winter would affect agriculture for several years, leading to major famines for unprepared nations. In upcoming podcast episodes, I will address in much greater detail the consequences of cosmic impact, which arguably is one of the most underrated issues facing humanity. Perhaps the most important takeaway from this close encounter is that we only had 1 day of lead time. That is not enough time for any preparation at all. It means no time to evacuate millions of people from a large region of the planetary surface. If 2018 GE3 landed in the ocean, it would trigger massive tsunamis that would devastate the coastal regions of any ocean it impacted, with tsunami waves up to 100 to 200 feet in height when they made landfall. Bringing the conversation closer to our day-to-day reality, I would say this. With all of the chaos, discord, and turmoil going on in the world today, it would seem that we are in urgent need of reflection on where we are going and what our priorities are as a nation and as a world in the next few years. While the American government continues to promote endless war and conflict around the world, ramping up a new Cold War with Russia that will, at best, cost trillions of dollars over the next decade and at worst, turn hot, plunging the world into nuclear apocalypse, cosmic debris like 2018 GE3 will continue to fly past our vulnerable planet to remind us that there are actually much larger issues which demand our attention, but to which the vast majority of the sleeping population of the world, including our pretend leaders, are oblivious. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk for just a minute about the upcoming Cosmic Summit conference that's going to be held in Greensboro, North Carolina, June 15th through 16th at the Sheraton Four Seasons Hotel. It is going to be an awesome event with amazing speakers and presentations covering a whole wide variety of compelling and interesting topics, including such things as cosmic impacts, the Younger Dryas, lost civilizations, megafaunal extinctions, forgotten ancient technologies, the plasma energy revolution, megalithic monument building, the Knights Templar, catastrophic geology, even Atlantis, the Clovis culture in North America, and that's just the beginning of the list. I think you should go to cosmicsummit.com, and you're going to be able to learn more. You're going to get to see bios on the speakers, on the presentation topics, and this is something not to be missed. This is a cutting-edge gathering of minds, some of the finest minds on the planet right now doing the kind of paradigm-changing work that we so desperately need. So this is something, and there's a lot of options too. There's a lot of options for involvement, whether it's in-house or live streams or only part of the conference. So go to cosmicsummit.com, check it out, and I hope to see you there. There's still seats left, and I think you will find that your time spent at the summit will be something that you carry with you for years and look back to as one of the most exciting events you've ever participated in. So I hope to see you there. So let's recap the terrain in which we currently find ourselves deployed. Ongoing studies of the near-Earth cosmic environment have all but proven that the accretion rate of meteoroidal debris is not uniformly dispersed through time, but is clustered, meaning that there are times when the Earth is more susceptible to being bombarded, maybe much more so, than one would conclude based upon the impact rate observed only during the time of recent scientific study. And it is becoming increasingly clear that even a relatively minor impact of a bolide from space could have substantial environmental and climatic effects and could, in the aftermath, trigger far-reaching economic consequences. Multiple impacts, such as could happen in the case of a 2018 GE3-sized object or larger, breaking apart on atmospheric entry, would be regionally devastating and would induce global climate changes severe enough to adversely affect agricultural production for at least a year, perhaps several years. Widespread crop failures would occur, causing devastating famines among vulnerable populations. The effects would be very similar to a volcanic winter. By learning from historical examples about the consequences of a globally disruptive volcanic event, will help us to better understand the similar effects of an impact-induced cosmic winter. Most volcanologists and climatologists are aware of the probability that powerful volcanic eruptions can trigger and have triggered serious adverse environmental and climatic effects. Just over 2 centuries ago, in the year 1816, a large portion of humankind had the misfortune to experience the effects of a volcanic winter. In April of the previous year, there occurred a gigantic eruption of Mount Tambora on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. While this eruption is considered to be the most powerful volcanic event of modern times, with a few exceptions, it remains at present largely unknown and forgotten. And this in spite of the profoundly important lessons it has to teach us about the planet we call home and its changing climate. So in the belief that this story deserves a much wider audience, I will here present a synopsis of the salient facts of the matter. I will first address the immediate effects of the eruption in the area of Indonesia, the location of Tambora, and then move on to the more widespread global effects. In the year 1812, after centuries of dormancy, Mount Tambora, the highest mountain in what was then the Dutch East Indies, began to awaken from a long slumber. Large columns of smoke and steam were seen emanating from the volcano's summit, while at the same time low-level seismic rumbling and small eruptions were heard and felt. As nature frequently does, the great volcano was giving forewarning of the disaster that was to come. The island nation of Indonesia has 147 volcanoes, of which 76 have been active during historical times. Tambora is a member of this chain of volcanoes, which lie along the Sunda Arc, a zone of tectonic convergence, where the Indian and Australian tectonic plates are being overridden by the lighter density Sunda and Burma plates in the process of subduction. The Sunda Arc is the exemplary case of an island arc, and the islands lying along the arc, Sumatra, Java, and the Lesser Sunda Islands, are the result of the ongoing volcanic activity emanating from this dynamic suture in the Earth's crust. Some of these volcanoes are among the most explosive and dangerous volcanoes on Earth. The more well-known volcano, Krakatoa, is a member of this family, as is Toba, the source of the most powerful known volcanic eruption during the time of humans on the Earth, which occurred about 74,000 years ago, a time incidentally when the human species came close to extinction, as evidenced by a genetic bottleneck that occurred around that time. These volcanoes, including Tambora, are of the type called stratovolcano, which is characterized by the classical symmetrical cone-shaped profile. The low-level activity increased in intensity over the next 3 years, and then, on April 5, 1815, Tambora erupted with earth-shaking violence. The sound of explosions accompanying the eruption were heard up to 870 miles away. By the next day, ash was raining down on the island of Java, over 300 miles away. For 4 days, the volcano continued to intensify in activity, and then, on April 10th, came the extraordinary climatic eruption during which the mountain blew 4,700 feet of its peak into the atmosphere in a massive explosion heard 1,200 miles away. Before the eruption, Mount Tambora stood 14,100 feet high. After the explosion, it was 9,350 feet. 1/3 of the mountain's height had been removed, either blasted into the atmosphere or dropping into the magma chamber. When the eruption began, 3 huge distinct columns of flame rose into the sky, where they fused into a single united mass of seething flames. Immediately after this, the mountain flanks were transformed into a mass of liquid fire as the pyroclastic flood descended towards the sea. The column of ejected ash reached an altitude of 27 miles into the stratosphere. Pumice and ash rained down upon the helpless island. Many of the millions of pumice stones bombarding the island were the size of grapefruits. The tremendous forces unleashed during the eruption spawned violent whirlwinds, which then blew away entire villages. Estimates for the total volume of the ejecta range between 40 and 50 cubic miles of material. The ashfall was so thick that the entire island of Sumbawa was buried under an ash blanket averaging 2 feet in thickness, while nearer to the volcano itself, the ash was up to 4 feet thick. It has been estimated that at the peak of the eruption, Tambora was ejecting magma at a rate of about 600,000 cubic meters per second. The merciless deluge of ash and pumice raining down destroyed houses, villages, and crops. The principalities of Pecat and Tambora were utterly obliterated, suffering a 100% mortality rate. The immediate death toll on the island is estimated to have been at least 10,000 individuals wiped out of existence in a few hours or even in a few minutes. Virtually all of the vegetation on the island was destroyed. Tens of thousands of uprooted trees were washed into the ocean, where, mixed with pumice, they formed a raft over 3 miles long. Large areas of Indonesia, up to 400 miles from the volcano, were shrouded in pitch darkness for days. A whole culture disappeared from the face of the earth without a trace as a result of the Tambora catastrophe. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. At the time of the eruption, it was estimated 95% of the crops were in the field and had not yet been harvested. As a result, virtually the entire harvest was destroyed. This led to widespread famine among the survivors. The starving people grew weak, and their immune systems weakened in turn, rendering them susceptible to the onset of disease. Especially pernicious among the survivors was the outbreak of diarrhea accompanied by high fever. The vulnerability of the survivors to disease was exacerbated by the fact that the ash and volcanic byproducts poisoned all the available water, transforming all the waterways into a toxic stew. People were reduced to groveling on the ground, eating dry leaves and poisonous tubers. Horses, which had been so prized and valued amongst the Sumbawan people, were eaten in a desperate attempt to avoid starvation. It is estimated that nearly 37,000 people died from starvation and disease, more than 3 times the number that died from the initial blast. Corpses were strewn everywhere, left to decompose where they had fallen. To add to the misery of the survivors, there was a rampant infestation of rats that rapidly consumed the last of the meager food supply. Many of the survivors willingly sold themselves as slaves to passing traders, preferring a life of slavery to the hardships that had overwhelmed them in the aftermath of the eruption. Animals, too, suffered, especially as the result of the total lack of clean water. Exceptionally hard hit were the horses, buffalo, and goats. The birds and the bee population were likewise decimated, both of which were a vital component of the agricultural foundation of the Sumbawan economy. Island nations to the west and north of Sumbawa, Bali and South Sulawesi, respectively, both at least 200 to 300 miles distant, were mantled with ash, in some places up to a foot thick. The island of Sumbawa had sustained a productive, vigorous economy with industrious inhabitants engaged in extensive trade throughout the archipelago. In the aftermath, the economy was utterly ruined. All of the materials necessary for survival had to be imported. And an important point is that when there was a regional catastrophe and a breakdown, such as we see here, there was at least an intact system, economic and ecosystem, by which the materials necessary for recovery could be imported. Recovery time was more than a decade. 4 years after the eruption, a report from an immigrant to the island, J.C. Vetter, described the situation as horrifying, with both ground and sea still choked with ash, pumice, and barren tree trunks, everywhere protruding from the mantle of pyroclastic material. The sterile ground was full of treacherous cracks and fissures that made traveling difficult, if not impossible. Vetter did note, however, here and there, the appearance of patches of green, exemplifying the power of nature to heal and restore a land devastated by catastrophe. These isolated patches of green were the radiant points from which vegetative life spread out to reclaim and replenish the wasteland. These were some of the immediate effects. The consequences of the Great Tambora eruption were not confined to the region of the Indonesian archipelago, but were felt worldwide, in some cases to a considerable degree, even years later. In 1815, there were no means by which one could know of such an event in real time if one was beyond the region of immediate destruction. But the effects were certainly experienced far removed from the scene of the catastrophe, without those who were affected knowing either the source or the cause of the forces of nature upsetting the balance of their world. The Great Tambora eruption triggered a series of events that historian John D. Post has called the last great subsistence crisis of the Western world. Along with the ash, pumice, magma, and pyroclastic flows, Mount Tambora ejected large quantities of SO2, or sulfur dioxide, into the atmosphere. Estimates have varied as to the exact amount, but have ranged from more than 10 million up to more than 100 million metric tons. Evidence would suggest that the quantity was toward the higher end of the estimated range. When SO2 is injected into the atmosphere, it reacts with water to form sulfate aerosols that produce acid rain and deplete the ozone layer. A large energetic volcanic eruption like Tambora will inject the sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it forms a volcanic smog that is beyond the dispersal capability of wind and rain. Here, the stratospheric sulfate aerosol veil, as it has been called, reflects sunlight back into space. The consequence of that should be obvious. The Earth undergoes a cooling, until the aerosols eventually disperse. In the spring and summer following the eruption of Tambora, the northeastern United States was subjected to a dry fog that so dimmed the atmosphere that people could look directly at the sun. In some cases, they were actually able to observe sunspots with the naked eye. The fog was strangely tenacious and was not dispersed by either surface wind or rain, which is consistent with the expected behavior of a sulfate aerosol veil. The consequences of the bitter cold that afflicted the Northern Hemisphere in the year 1816 were far-reaching. The reverberations of that event are still echoing today. In the next part of this podcast, I will describe what happened in the aftermath of the Great Tambora eruption and the central role it played in influencing the vector of modern history. So I will see you in the next part of this podcast.